And my study is based on a study that has been funded by RIFTL in 2021. It's called Educators' Experiences of Using Multilingual Pedagogies During Emergency Remote Teaching, and it aims to analyze the experiences of South African academics based on how the adoption of emergency remote teaching influenced their use of multilingual pedagogies. Apologies for that. I just want to go back. And I want to just stop sharing my video for bandwidth purposes. Okay, great. So this phenomenological study sought to answer the question, what were the experiences of South African lecturers with multilingual emergency remote teaching amid the COVID-19 pandemic? It's born out of my own experiences as a lecturer who has employed multilingual pedagogies for the past few years in my teaching in journalism education. At the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, I noticed that doing this actually became quite difficult. While my senior students still submitted multilingual work, and I think this is because they'd become accustomed to doing so over the years, my first year class virtually submitted no multilingual work. And so I looked at myself and what had changed. I then thought to talk to other lecturers who I know were using multilingualism in teaching and learning to hear what their experiences were. This gave rise then to this study that I'm going to share portions of in my presentation today. Since the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 a global pandemic in 2020, universities across the world have undergone unanticipated changes in how they operate and deliver the academic program. Chief among these changes has been the adoption of emergency remote teaching, which saw in-person activities like classroom-based teaching as well as laboratory work ceasing overnight, as teaching and learning moved completely online in an attempt to prevent the spread of the virus through contact with other people. So emergency remote teaching is the sudden shift from in-person instructional teaching to wholly online teaching due to a crisis. It is not to be confused with online teaching, which is an approach to teaching and learning that requires careful planning and is designed with specific models in mind. In seeking to tease out the participants' reflections on the shifts experienced by them concerning the use of multilingual pedagogies during ERT amid the pandemic, I have drawn on critical pedagogy as my framework. This philosophy is based on diverse principles that encourage the critique of structures of power and oppression to create conditions needed to realize the emancipatory ideal of a democratic education. To reflect on this, I have used this notion of lecturers as agents, which is a feature of critical pedagogy that prompts educators to think about what they teach and how they teach it in light of the context they are in, and in so doing raises their and their students' critical consciousness. So in their role as agents, lecturers are aware of their power to empower students to be subjects of their own autonomy instead of objects of education. Nyoni argues that this notion of lecturers as agents is crucial for the South African context, as it focuses on an education that aims to emancipate and educate everyone, regardless of their race, class, gender, and in my case, I would add language, with the structure of an oppressive society being the target of this transformation. My focus then on multilingualism stems from the long-standing issues of power and language in South African higher education. Multilingual education is used to refer to the diverse use of language practices to educate, and I argue in other studies that have been published that it facilitates epistemic access and transformation. Garcia and Lin note that multilingual education takes on a social justice purpose, reinforcing the idea that language is used by people to communicate and participate in multiple contexts and societies. As such, the use of diverse languages in education not only enhances learning capacity, more crucially, it affords educators and students the means to draw on their different worldviews as they deliberate on discipline-specific concepts using their languages. In post-colonial contexts such as ours, where there was a systematic attempt to de-intellectualize the use of indigenous languages through discriminatory practices, the systems of thinking vested in indigenous languages continue to be marginalized, as colonial languages such as English continue to be the lingua franca used in prestigious spaces such as universities. The importance of the issue of multilingual teaching online is further underscored by the fact that, according to Cornea, indigenous languages are undergoing a massive die-off or a linguisticide due to the increased use of digital technologies. Cornea says that around only 5% of the world's languages are likely to survive online, while for the rest, the 95%, the depressing prognosis is that there is very little hope of them crossing the digital divide. So I have undertaken this qualitative phenomenological study where I spoke to 7 lecturers from 7 different South African universities, having purposively selected them to participate based on their previous experiences with multilingual pedagogies. The lecturers who took part are in diverse fields, including politics, history, and education. Some are in traditional universities and others are in universities of technology. The study foregrounds their reflections of shifts that occurred for them because they had prior experience with multilingual pedagogies before the adoption of emergency remote teaching. And these pedagogies included things like using translations, translanguaging, and code switching in their teaching. The participants' reflections reveal that essentially they found using multilingual pedagogies amid emergency remote teaching very challenging. And after doing a thematic analysis, I have arrived at 3 categories of the shifts or the challenging shifts experienced by these lecturers. They did have reflections of positives, but the focus of this particular presentation is on the challenges. The challenges were shifts from in-person to on-screen interactions, shifts in the types of multilingual resources, multimodal resources used to teach multilingually, and shifts from approaches that intellectualize indigenous languages to approaches that focused heavily on the delivery of content. So beginning then with the first category of shifts, namely shifts from in-person to on-screen interactions, one of the key things that multilingual education often employs is group work. Group work has been found to be highly effective in encouraging meaningful multilingual peer-to-peer engagement because it brings together linguistically diverse students. Students adopt strategies such as translanguaging and translation to facilitate meaning making as they work towards the common goal in the group. And as students interact with their peers using these strategies and drawing on diverse linguistic repertoires, including indigenous languages, the group work becomes a critical transformative approach to ensuring that these languages, which are often excluded from academic spaces, are used and intellectualized. When happening in person then, because students are physically located in the same space, namely a classroom, when a misunderstanding happens, which is likely in a multilingual context, students have additional communicative elements to draw on, including being able to read the nonverbal communication of their peers. In an online environment, though, Graham and Misangchu argue that the technologically mediated character of the interactions introduces particular challenges when it comes to communicating the unseen, including not understanding, for example, what silence means and not being able to draw on body language to ascertain what their peers are communicating. So being aware of these challenges, while the academics surveyed in the study used group work previously quite extensively as part of their approach to multilingual teaching, they noted that these communicative dynamics online made it difficult to do so while teaching remotely. So for example, one of the participants said that the breakaway groups, when they managed to, they could hear it's not the same. It's these voices, nobody knows who the other person is. They've never met their fellow students. A consequence of these lecturers not using group work as much as they usually do is that the peer-to-peer collaborations that students engage in to make and negotiate meaning multilingually did not occur to the same degree. And as one of the other participants noted, you cannot have a university where students of different classes and backgrounds don't meet. This lecturer relies on working class students, the suburban student, Afrikaner student, Christian student, the anarchist student, the fallist. She says, I rely on all of them in my class to learn from each other. The second category of shifts relates to the shifts in the types of multimodal resources used to teach multilingually. Currently, the corpus of online educational resources in indigenous South African languages aimed at university students is extremely limited. As such, academics who use multilingual pedagogies are often forced to develop their own resources, such as glossaries and videos. This process of developing these resources takes time, and in the context of emergency remote teaching, which is mainly geared at ensuring the delivery of content because we want to get through the curriculum, it was something that was not prioritized. In the long term, the development of resources may bode well for boosting availability of online content in indigenous languages, but as my participants noted, for example, the participant quoted here, this takes a lot of time, and in the long run, it can be discouraging for lecturers. This participant said, those things, which is the development of resources, are generally time consuming. They take a lot of time just to translate a short briefed text. We're talking about an hour or more. So I would say I spend more time developing resources for learning, but if it was face-to-face, I'll use the time to talk more. Another participant spoke about how cumbersome it was for her to employ multimodal translanguaging when demonstrating to students on how to engage in multiliteracy teaching multilingually. She said, it's been hard to demonstrate to students using a newsprint, for example, because newsprint is one way of teaching. When you are using your newsprint, you are bringing in shared writing. You are combining multilingualism and multiliteracy because you are writing down what people say and you are doing that simultaneously. It's difficult to do that online. The final category of shifts, and in my paper, this is the one that I really dwell on because this is the essence of the argument that I seek to make. It's the shifts from approaches that intellectualize indigenous languages to approaches that are focused on delivery of content. Multilingual pedagogies are essential because firstly, they can be used to deliver course content, and secondly, to ensure epistemic access. But more importantly, they are vital in intellectualizing and developing indigenous language repertoires to ensure that these languages are used in the prestigious task of knowledge generation. When we talk of language intellectualization, we are talking about the planned process of accelerating the growth and development of our indigenous languages to enhance their effective interface with modern developments, theories, and concepts. Through intellectualization, new terms are coined and the language is modernized to be used for specialized communication. Intellectualization entails the development of indigenous languages in high-stakes contexts such as government administration, science, technology, and of course, teaching and learning in higher education. One of the consequences of online learning, which in our case in South Africa was conducted almost exclusively in English, is that if this continues, it can derail the work that has been done to date in intellectualizing the indigenous languages and may play a role in accelerating linguisticide where these languages die off in online education spaces. So to this end, Garcia and Lin argue that simply teaching in a monolingual mode that reflects the language practices legitimized in the dominant group or the state, which is English and Afrikaans in our case, is harmful to children or students in this context. It results in academic failure, linguistic and identity insecurities, and the inability to enjoy the critical metalinguistic awareness that enables students to become critical analysts and users of language in society. And of course, it results in restricting the language repertoire of children to that sanctioned and upheld by the political state in which the education system functions, most of the time resulting in monolingualism or in what we might call a restricted bilingualism, meaning that students are taught to suppress some of the features of their repertoires as inappropriate instead of expanding them fully. The experience of the lecturers who took part in the study was that because the online mode of emergency remote teaching focused on the delivery of content, they could not engage in the kind of multilingual teaching that would create conditions where intellectualization of indigenous languages occurs. One participant was saying that multilingualism, if it continues in this way, will become mechanical because it's going to actually be more about translating our lectures now into isiXhosa, rather than using multilingualism to provoke and to say, hey, Marilise, which is a term she uses to speak about an Afrikaans student, you need to be hearing your lecturer talking this Xhosa. We have resources in all official languages. All lectures are translated for our students because we are a good corporate university. That's what you're going to get. It will not be intellectualization of multilingual process. It will be mechanizing it for the sake of ticking boxes and claiming that you are providing access. But in fact, you will be destroying the very epistemic role of multilingualism, which is to socialize the student and give democracy to the epistemic space. Finlayson and Madiba argue that effective intellectualization is what will see indigenous languages developed within the shortest possible time to a point where they can express concepts that already exist in languages like English and Afrikaans. For this to occur, the focus must be given to capturing African languages in written form in order to develop the lexical and grammatical dimensions. This proved to be a challenge in the context of emergency remote teaching because some of the web-based learner management systems, like the Blackboard we use, do not have the capabilities to support texts written in African languages. So here, this lecturer...
Sorry, Sisanda, you have 5 minutes to conclude. Sorry for that.
Okay, so this lecturer here notes, for example, that one of the difficulties with the transition is that it's very difficult to write online exams in an African language because you need specialized characters. But on these learner management systems, those characters don't exist. As far back as 2014, scholars have been calling for what is understood as localization of learner management systems, especially the interfaces, to promote instruction in indigenous African languages and further promote the function and status of these languages in the ICT domain. But given that, we are seeing that this has not happened, it would seem that this idea of localizing learner management systems is not a priority. The research exists that points to the crucial role it can play in the intellectualization of indigenous languages, and yet not much has been done within the higher education space in the South African context. So for the reasons that I have highlighted in this study and that I elaborate on in my paper, the move to emergency remote teaching was really challenging for multilingual lecturers who teach using multilingual pedagogies. And the crux of it is that the focus is on content delivery, such that meaningful use of multilingual pedagogies was not employed. According to these educators, multilingual teaching online, particularly in this context, does not bode well for the intellectualization of indigenous South African languages. So I think going forward, CPUT needs to prioritize localizing Blackboard and bring in a multilingual interface. Lecturers and even students need to be given workshops on using multilingualism online and the further development of online multilingual resources. And finally, lecturers should reflect on what they can do in their own teaching to be more multilingual. Thank you very much. If you've got any questions, you can send me an email. And as soon as the study becomes available, I look forward to sharing it with colleagues.
Thanks, Sisanda. Any questions, colleagues? Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. I feel like with multilingual teaching, we always come across the same issues, even though this has now moved to online. But then the challenges that are mentioned are still the same challenges that that often come up, even with in contact teaching. Now, I just wanted to ask, I know you're focusing on the challenges. Are there interventions that the other lecturers have identified that can help with the promotion of multilingualism and intellectualization of African languages going forward? Because it seems we are stuck with online. So to dismiss it as just saying the whole multilingual teaching is time consuming, might be, well, like I said, one of the excuses that we often hear most of the time. Thanks.
Yes, so I think they have said that resources need to be allocated to affording lecturers the opportunity to develop these resources. So funding needs to be allocated to afford lecturers the opportunity to develop these multilingual resources. The point they were making is the emphasis, multilingualism fell completely by the wayside in terms of priorities for institutions. And we are seeing the consequences of that now. There is an opportunity, though, to remedy the situation where if a lecturer employs multilingual pedagogies, perhaps getting a lighter teaching load so that they can focus on the development of these resources. Because one of the things that is a big gap in terms of teaching multilingually online is the lack of resources, academic resources. They had to rely on videos on YouTube, which are good, but we want journal articles and textbooks. And for that to happen, you know, there actually need to be resources set aside. So that was the main thing that they drove home, that funding needs to be set aside and time needs to be set aside for lecturers who use multilingualism to develop the resources. And then they did highlight positives. So with online, there is multimodality. So while I'm speaking in English now, you could have a subtitle in Xhosa, for example, or an accompanying something in another language that really allows for multilingualism to be realized in ways that in person you can't. So there are opportunities, but it definitely needs to be on the agenda of institutions to make it a reality.
Thank you for that. Any other question, colleagues? If you still have questions, then you think of something after this, then you can contact Sisanda or maybe just put something on our chat. Thank you so much. Then I'll hand over to our next